What if everything you've been taught about Christianity was decided not by divine revelation, but by a political committee? What if the faith practiced by billions today was deliberately constructed in 325 AD to serve the needs of a Roman emperor who needed religious unity to hold his crumbling empire together? What if the heretical beliefs that were banned at the Council of Nicaea were actually closer to original Christian teachings than the orthodox doctrine that survived? Tonight, we're going to uncover the shocking truth about how modern Christianity was manufactured through political manipulation, systematic suppression, and the deliberate destruction of alternative gospels that told a completely different story about Jesus, his teachings, and the nature of divine truth. This isn't about attacking faith, it's about revealing how political power shaped religious belief in ways that still control what billions of people are allowed to think about God, salvation, and spiritual reality. Like this video and subscribe, because what you're about to discover will forever change how you understand the relationship between political authority and religious truth. Asterisk for the first 3 centuries after Christ's death. Christianity wasn't a single religion. It was a collection of radically different movements that agreed on almost nothing, except that Jesus had been an important teacher. In Alexandria, Egypt, Christians believed that salvation came through secret knowledge passed down from Jesus to his closest disciples. In Syria, they taught that Jesus had never actually died on the cross, but had been replaced by a substitute at the last moment. In Asia Minor, they practiced a form of Christianity where women served as priests and bishops, claiming authority from Mary Magdalene herself. These weren't minor variations on a central theme, they were fundamentally different religions that happened to share the name Christian. They had different holy books, different creation stories, different understandings of who Jesus was, and completely different ideas about what it meant to be saved. The Christianity practiced in Rome bore little resemblance to the Christianity practiced in Jerusalem, which was completely different from the Christianity practiced in North Africa or Persia. This diversity wasn't accidental, it reflected the reality that early Christian communities had developed independently, often with minimal contact with each other. They were interpreting the legacy of Jesus through the lens of their own cultural traditions, philosophical frameworks, and spiritual needs. Egyptian Christians incorporated elements of ancient mystery religions. Jewish Christians maintained strict adherence to Mosaic law. Greek Christians emphasized philosophical speculation about the nature of divine reality. But here's what makes this diversity so dangerous to the official story. Many of these alternative forms of Christianity had stronger claims to authenticity than the version that would eventually triumph at Nicaea. The Ebionites, a Jewish Christian sect, claimed direct descent from Jesus' original disciples and maintained that he had been a human prophet rather than a divine being. The Gnostics possessed Gospels attributed to Thomas, Mary Magdalene, and Judas that contained sayings and teachings not found in the canonical New Testament. Most threatening of all were the communities that preserved oral traditions about Jesus' actual teachings that suggested he had taught reincarnation, the equality of women, and the possibility of direct spiritual enlightenment without institutional mediation. These groups didn't need bishops or elaborate church hierarchies because they believed every individual could access divine truth through personal, spiritual practice. The Gospel of Thomas, discovered in 1945 but written in the 2nd century, preserves many of these dangerous teachings. It presents Jesus not as a sacrifice for human sin, but as a wisdom teacher who revealed that the divine kingdom was already present within every person. If you bring forth what is within you, what you bring forth will save you, Jesus says in this text. If you do not bring forth what is within you, what you do not bring forth will destroy you. This is radically different from the Christianity that emerged from Nicaea, where salvation required belief in specific doctrines and submission to church authority. The Thomas Christians didn't need priests to mediate their relationship with God, believed divine reality was directly accessible to anyone who understood Jesus' true teachings. The Gospel of Mary presents an even more subversive vision, depicting Mary Magdalene as Jesus' most trusted disciple and the recipient of secret teachings that he shared with no one else. In this text, the male disciples are jealous of Mary's special relationship with Jesus and attempt to exclude her from leadership. Roles a conflict the early church fathers would resolve by erasing women from positions of authority and rewriting Mary Magdalene as a reformed prostitute rather than an apostolic leader. Perhaps most dangerous of all were the texts that suggested Jesus had survived the crucifixion and continued teaching for years afterward. The second treatise of the Great Seth, another Gnostic text, claims that Jesus laughed at his executioners because they were killing a substitute, while his spiritual essence remained untouched. The Apocalypse of Peter describes a similar scenario where Jesus watches his own execution from a spiritual realm, explaining to Peter that what appeared to be his death was actually an illusion. These aren't just alternative stories, they represent completely different understandings of what Jesus' mission had been and what his followers were supposed to do. Instead of focusing on his death as an atoning sacrifice, these texts emphasized his teachings as a path to spiritual transformation. Instead of requiring belief in his divinity, they suggested that humans could achieve the same spiritual status through proper understanding and practice. But by 308, this beautiful diversity was becoming a political problem. The Roman Empire was fragmenting under economic pressure, military threats, and internal conflicts. Different regions were developing separate identities, languages, and loyalties. What the empire needed was a unifying force that could hold the diverse populations together under a single cultural framework. Christianity seemed like the perfect solution, except that Christians themselves couldn't agree on what Christianity actually meant. There were dozens of competing sects, hundreds of different gospels, and thousands of disputes about fundamental questions like the nature of Christ, the requirements for salvation, and the structure of church authority. Emperor Diocletian had tried to solve the Christian problem through persecution, launching the most systematic and brutal campaign against Christian communities in Roman history. But persecution only made Christianity more popular and more fragmented, as different groups developed different strategies for survival and different interpretations of what their suffering meant. By the time Constantine defeated his rivals and became sole emperor in 312 AD, a new approach was needed. Instead of trying to destroy Christianity, Constantine decided to control it. But first, he would need to transform it from a diverse collection of competing movements into a single, unified institution that could serve imperial needs. This transformation would require making some very difficult decisions about which versions of Christianity would be allowed to survive and which would be eliminated forever. It would require creating new doctrines that had never existed before, suppressing ancient teachings that had been preserved for centuries, and rewriting the entire history of the Christian movement to make it appear that orthodox belief had always been the mainstream position. The Council of Nicaea was called not to discover truth about Christian doctrine, but to manufacture it. And the truths that were banned at Nicaea reveal a very different Christianity than the one most people know today. Christianity that might have created a very different world if it had been allowed to survive. By 312 AD, Constantine faced the most critical decision of his reign. The Roman Empire was dying, torn apart by civil wars, economic collapse, and the rise of competing religious movements that threatened to fragment what remained of imperial unity. Traditional Roman religion had lost its power to bind diverse populations together. The old gods seemed powerless against barbarian invasions, plague, and social chaos. What Constantine needed was a new kind of spiritual authority that could hold his empire together, but the fastest growing religion in his territories was itself split into dozens of warring factions. Christianity presented both Constantine's greatest opportunity and his most dangerous challenge. On one hand, Christian communities existed throughout the empire, providing a potential foundation for cultural unity that transcended ethnic and regional boundaries. Christian leaders had demonstrated remarkable organizational skills, creating networks that could mobilize resources, disseminate information, and maintain loyalty across vast distances. Most importantly, Christianity offered a universal message that could potentially appeal to all imperial subjects, regardless of their local traditions or social status. But the Christianity of 312 AD wasn't a single religion, it was a battlefield. Arian Christians taught that Jesus was subordinate to God the Father, making them theological enemies of Trinitarian Christians who insisted on the co-equality of Father and Son. Gnostic Christians claimed that salvation came through secret knowledge, putting them in direct conflict with proto-Orthodox Christians who emphasized faith and church authority. Donatist Christians in North Africa refused to recognize the legitimacy of clergy who had collaborated with Roman authorities during previous persecutions, creating a schism that threatened to permanently divide the African church. These weren't academic theological disputes. They were practical political problems that made Christian unity impossible. Christian bishops were excommunicating each other. Christian communities were refusing to worship together, and Christian emperors would need to choose sides in conflicts they didn't understand and couldn't resolve through traditional political methods. Constantine's solution was characteristically pragmatic and ruthlessly effective. Instead of trying to determine which version of Christianity was theologically correct, he would decide which version was politically useful. Instead of allowing theological diversity to continue fragmenting his empire, he would impose religious uniformity through imperial authority. Instead of waiting for Christians to resolve their disputes through spiritual discernment, he would convene a council that could establish official doctrine through political consensus. But Constantine faced a fundamental problem. He wasn't a theologian, and he didn't particularly care about the spiritual questions that divided Christian communities. His primary concern was imperial stability, not religious truth. This meant that the council he was planning would inevitably prioritize political considerations over theological accuracy, imperial unity over spiritual authenticity, and institutional authority over individual conscience. The emperor's personal relationship with Christianity was itself problematic. Constantine claimed to have experienced a vision before the Battle of Milvian Bridge that convinced him to fight under Christian symbols. But he didn't actually convert to Christianity until he was on his deathbed over 20 years later. Throughout his reign, he continued to serve as Pontifex Maximus, the high priest of traditional Roman religion, while simultaneously positioning himself as the protector of Christian faith. This religious ambiguity wasn't accidentally, was strategic. By maintaining connections to both Christian and pagan traditions, Constantine could appeal to different constituencies while avoiding complete commitment to either. But it also meant that his approach to Christian theology would be shaped more by political calculation than by genuine spiritual conviction. Constantine's advisors understood that resolving Christian theological disputes would require more than imperial authority. It would require the appearance of divine sanction. The council they were planning couldn't simply impose Constantine's preferred doctrines. It needed to create the impression that orthodox Christian belief had been established through spiritual discernment rather than political manipulation. This requirement led to one of the most sophisticated propaganda campaigns in ancient history. The Council of Nicaea would be presented as a gathering of holy bishops seeking divine truth, when it was actually a carefully orchestrated political event designed to eliminate theological diversity and establish imperial control over Christian doctrine. The bishops who attended would be selected for their willingness to support Constantine's agenda, not for their spiritual wisdom or theological expertise. But the most crucial element of Constantine's strategy was the systematic suppression of alternative Christian voices. The council couldn't simply choose between existing theological positions. It needed to ensure that dangerous alternatives were permanently eliminated from consideration. This meant not just condemning heretical teachings, but destroying the texts that preserved them, silencing the teachers who transmitted them, and creating new historical narratives that made orthodox belief appear to have been the original and authentic Christian. Positioned at the scale of this suppression campaign was unprecedented in ancient history. Entire libraries of Christian texts would be burned. Bishops who refused to accept Nicene orthodoxy would be exiled. Christian communities that maintained alternative traditions would be disbanded. The rich theological diversity that had characterized the first 3 centuries of Christianity would be reduced to a single, officially approved version that served imperial needs, rather than preserving authentic Christian heritage. But Constantine's advisors also understood that successful suppression required more than destruction, it required replacement. The alternative Christian traditions that were being eliminated had provided their followers with compelling answers to fundamental spiritual questions. Orthodox Christianity would need to offer equally compelling alternatives, even if those alternatives bore little resemblance to original Christian teachings. This replacement process would involve creating new doctrines that had never existed in early Christianity, rewriting the history of Christian development to make recent innovations appear ancient, and developing institutional structures that could maintain theological uniformity across the diverse populations of the empire. The Christianity that emerged from Nicaea would be a fundamentally different religion than the Christianity that had existed before Constantine's intervention. The emperor's dilemma was essentially this: he needed Christian unity to hold his empire together, but achieving that unity would require destroying the very diversity that had made Christianity attractive to so many different populations. He needed Christian authority to legitimize his rule, but establishing that authority would require political manipulation that undermined any claim to divine sanction. He needed Christian doctrine to provide spiritual meaning for his subjects, but creating that doctrine would require suppressing alternative teachings that might have been closer to authentic Christian tradition. Constantine chose political expediency over spiritual authenticity, imperial unity over theological diversity. institutional control over individual conscience. The Council of Nicaea would be the mechanism through which these choices were implemented, and the dangerous alternatives were eliminated forever. The bishops who gathered at Nicaea in 325 AD thought they were participating in a theological council that would clarify Christian doctrine through prayer and spiritual discernment. They didn't realize they were actually implementing a political agenda that would fundamentally transform Christianity from a diverse spiritual movement into a uniform imperial institution. The theological decisions they made would be presented as divinely inspired truth, when they were actually the result of careful political calculation, designed to serve Constantine's imperial needs. But some of the bishops suspected what was really happening. Letters and chronicles from the period reveal growing concerns about the political manipulation of theological truth, the suppression of legitimate alternative teachings, and the transformation of Christianity into an instrument of imperial control. These voices of conscience would be among the first casualties of the post-Nicaea suppression campaign. The emperor's dilemma had been resolved, but the solution would have consequences that extended far beyond Constantine's lifetime. The Christianity that survived Nicaea would bear the marks of its political origins for centuries to come, and the alternatives that were eliminated would continue to haunt the Orthodox tradition that replaced them. In the years leading up to the Council of Nicaea, the Christian world was engaged in theological warfare that threatened to tear apart not just religious communities, but the social fabric of the entire Roman Empire. What most people don't understand is that these weren't abstract, philosophical debates. They were life and death struggles over the most fundamental questions of human existence, divine nature, and spiritual authority that would determine the future of Western civilization. The conflict that would dominate the council centered around a brilliant theologian named Arius, a priest from Alexandria who had developed a sophisticated philosophical argument that Jesus Christ was subordinate to God the Father. To modern ears, this might sound like a minor theological distinction, but in the 4th century, it was revolutionary heresy that struck at the heart of emerging Christian orthodoxy. Arius argued that if Jesus was truly the Son of God, then logically he must have been created by the Father and therefore couldn't be co-eternal or co-equal with him. There was a time when the Son was not, Arius taught, using philosophical reasoning that appealed to educated Christians throughout the empire. His position wasn't based on mystical revelation or church authority. It was derived from careful logical analysis of Christian scripture and philosophical principles. What made Arianism so dangerous wasn't just its theological content, but its method. Arius encouraged individual Christians to use their own reasoning to understand divine truth, rather than simply accepting whatever church authorities told them. He translated complex theological concepts into popular songs and poems that ordinary people could understand and remember. He created a grassroots theological movement that bypassed traditional church hierarchies and appealed directly to the intellectual and spiritual hunger of Christian believers. By 328, Arian Christianity had spread throughout the Eastern Empire, attracting support from bishops, scholars, and even members of the imperial family. Arian communities established their own churches, ordained their own clergy, and developed their own theological schools that rivaled those of the proto-Orthodox establishment. They weren't a marginal sect, represented a genuine alternative to the Christianity that would eventually triumph at Nicaea. But Arianism was just one of many alternative Christian traditions that flourished before the council. In Syria and Mesopotamia, communities of believers followed teachings preserved in the Gospel of Thomas, which presented Jesus as a wisdom teacher whose primary message was that the divine kingdom existed within every human soul. These Thomas Christians didn't focus on Jesus' death and resurrection. They emphasized his sayings and parables as keys to spiritual transformation. If you bring forth what is within you, what you bring forth will save you, Jesus says in the Gospel of Thomas. If you do not bring forth what is within you, what you do not bring forth will destroy you. This teaching suggested that salvation came through inner spiritual development, rather than external religious observance. Message that threatened to make institutional Christianity irrelevant in Egypt and North Africa. Gnostic communities preserved traditions that traced back to supposed secret teachings Jesus had shared with his closest disciples. These groups possessed dozens of alternative gospels, including texts attributed to Mary Magdalene, Philip, and even Judas Iscariot. The Gnostic understanding of Christianity was radically different from what would emerge at Nicaea. They taught that the material world was a prison created by a false god, that true divinity existed in a spiritual realm beyond physical reality, and that salvation came through gnosis knowledge rather than faith. Perhaps most threatening to the emerging Orthodox establishment were the Christian communities that maintained the leadership roles of women that had characterized the earliest Christian movements. The Gospel of Mary presents Mary Magdalene as the disciple who received Jesus' deepest teachings, superior in understanding to Peter and the other male apostles. Sister, we know that the Savior loved you more than the rest of women, the disciples tell Mary in this text. Tell us the words of the Savior which you remember, which you know, but we do not. Archaeological evidence from the 3rd and 4th centuries reveals that women served as bishops, priests, and theological teachers in many Christian communities before Nicaea. Inscriptions from this period identify women as presbytera female priest, episcopa female bishop, and even apostola female apostle. These weren't honorary titles, they represented actual leadership positions that gave women authority to teach, perform sacraments, and guide Christian communities. The pre-Nicea Christian world also included communities that taught reincarnation as a central doctrine. The Christian philosopher Origen, one of the most influential theologians of the 3rd century, argued that souls existed before birth and could be reborn multiple times, as part of their spiritual evolution toward divine unity. This teaching was based on careful analysis of biblical texts and philosophical reasoning about the nature of divine justice. The soul has neither beginning nor end, Origen wrote. Every soul comes into this world strengthened by the victories or weakened by the defeats of its previous life. This understanding of reincarnation wasn't borrowed from Eastern religions, it emerged from Christian theological reflection on questions like why innocent children suffer and how divine justice operates across different lifetimes. These alternative Christian traditions weren't marginal curiosities. They represented sophisticated theological systems that had developed over centuries and attracted millions of followers throughout the Roman Empire. They had their own bishops, their own scriptures, their own theological schools, and their own understanding of what it meant to follow Jesus Christ. What made these alternatives so dangerous to Constantine's political agenda wasn't their theological content, but their diversity. An empire that included Arian Christians, Gnostic Christians, Thomas Christians, and Orthodox Christians would never achieve the religious unity that Constantine needed to hold his territories together. Different Christian communities would continue to excommunicate each other, refuse to cooperate on imperial projects, and maintain separate identities that reinforced regional rather than imperial loyalties. But the alternatives were also dangerous because many of them challenged institutional authority in ways that threatened not just religious hierarchies, but political hierarchies as well. If Christians could achieve salvation through individual spiritual practice, as the Thomas Christians taught, what need was there for elaborate church structures? If women could serve as bishops and apostles, as many pre-Nicaea communities believed, what did that say about male-dominated political institutions? If souls were reborn multiple times, as Origen's followers taught, what happened to the urgency of imperial control over religious doctrine? The Council of Nicaea would need to eliminate these dangerous alternatives while creating the impression that Orthodox Christianity had always been the mainstream position. This would require not just condemning heretical teachings, but rewriting the history of Christian development to make 3 centuries of theological diversity appear to have been a temporary deviation from original truth. The bishops who gathered at Nicaea weren't just choosing between different interpretations of Christian doctrine, they were deciding which version of Christianity would be allowed to survive and which would be systematically destroyed. The beautiful theological diversity that had characterized the first 3 centuries of Christianity would be reduced to a single, official version that served Constantine's political needs rather than preserving authentic Christian heritage. But the alternatives that were banned at Nicaea didn't disappear completely. They went underground, preserved in hidden texts, secret traditions, and marginalized communities that maintained dangerous knowledge despite official persecution. The theological battlefield that Constantine thought he had pacified through imperial authority would continue to simmer beneath the surface of Orthodox Christianity for centuries to come. The Council of Nicaea marks the moment when political power successfully imposed its will on spiritual truth, when imperial authority trumped theological diversity, when fear of institutional chaos overcame respect for authentic Christian tradition. The Christianity that emerged from Nicaea bore the marks of this political intervention, and the alternatives that were eliminated continued to haunt the Orthodox tradition that replaced them. The invitations that went out across the Roman Empire in early 325 AD appeared to be calling bishops to a holy council for spiritual discernment about Christian doctrine. The reality was far more calculated. Constantine and his advisor, Hosius of Cordoba, were assembling a carefully selected group of religious leaders who could be manipulated into legitimizing predetermined political decisions while maintaining the appearance of divine guidance. The selection process for council attendees reveals the sophisticated political engineering behind what history remembers as a theological gathering. Bishops known to support Arian theology received delayed invitations or were informed that travel funding was unavailable. Bishops from regions where alternative Christian traditions flourished were told that their attendance was unnecessary because their theological positions were already well understood. Meanwhile, bishops who had demonstrated loyalty to imperial authority and hostility to theological diversity received priority invitations, imperial transportation, and advance briefings on the emperor's expectations. Bishop Hosius, Constantine's primary religious advisor, spent months before the council traveling throughout the empire to meet privately with bishops who would attend. These weren't casual consultations, they were strategic preparation sessions where Hosius outlined the theological positions that would be acceptable to the emperor, and the consequences for bishops who refused to cooperate. Attendees were given advance copies of draft creedal statements and asked to suggest modifications that would make them more palatable while maintaining their essential content. The council's location in Nicaea was itself a strategic choice. The city was close enough to Constantinople that Constantine could maintain direct oversight of proceedings, but far enough from major Christian centers like Alexandria, Antioch, and Rome that local Christian communities couldn't easily influence the deliberations. The bishops would be isolated in an imperial city, surrounded by Constantine's guards, dependent on imperial hospitality, and constantly reminded of who held ultimate authority over their proceedings. But the most sophisticated aspect of the pre-council preparation was the creation of what modern political scientists would recognize as controlled opposition. Hosius identified bishops who supported theological positions that the emperor wanted to condemn and made sure they received invitations to attend. These bishops weren't invited because Constantine wanted to hear their arguments. They were invited because their presence would allow the council to formally condemn their teachings, while claiming to have given them fair hearings. Arius himself was initially excluded from the council, then invited at the last moment in a carefully orchestrated sequence that made his condemnation appear inevitable rather than predetermined. When Arius arrived in Nicaea, he found that most of the bishops who might have supported his theological position had been excluded from the proceedings, while those who attended had already been convinced that Arianism represented a dangerous threat to Christian unity that needed to be eliminated. The physical arrangements for the council were designed to reinforce imperial authority over theological deliberation. Constantine seated himself on a golden throne at the head of the assembly hall, literally placing imperial power above episcopal authority. The bishops were arranged in a semicircle facing the emperor, creating a visual hierarchy that made clear who held ultimate decision-making power. Guards stood at every entrance, ostensibly for security but actually to remind attendees that they were participating in an imperial event rather than an independent religious gathering. The agenda for the council was predetermined through months of careful preparation. Hosius had already drafted the essential elements of what would become the Nicene Creed, working with theologians who understood both Constantine's political needs and the theological language necessary to make imperial preferences appear doctrinally sound. The bishops weren't gathering to explore theological questions through open debate. They were being asked to ratify decisions that had already been made through political calculation. Contemporary accounts reveal that many bishops were uncomfortable with the level of imperial control over what was supposed to be a spiritual process. Bishop Ambrose of Milan wrote privately that the emperor has made himself judge over judges, deciding matters that should be resolved through prayer and divine guidance, rather than imperial decree. Bishop Gregory of Nazianzus complained that we are being asked to choose between theological positions as if we were selecting candidates for political office rather than discerning divine truth. But these concerns were suppressed through a combination of intimidation, bribery, and social pressure. Bishops who raised questions about imperial interference were reminded that their dioceses depended on imperial protection and funding. Those who suggested that theological diversity might be acceptable were informed that such positions would be interpreted as disloyalty to the emperor. Most effectively, bishops were told that failure to achieve consensus at Nicaea would result in continued persecution of Christians by those who opposed religious unity. The theological debates that took place at Nicaea were carefully managed theatre, designed to create the impression of genuine deliberation while ensuring predetermined outcomes. Josias controlled the speaking schedule, determining which bishops could present arguments and in what order. He provided advance copies of statements that bishops were expected to support and private coaching for those who seemed uncertain about their positions. Most importantly, he made clear that theological positions that contradicted imperial preferences would not be given serious consideration, regardless of their scriptural or philosophical merit. The most revealing aspect of the council's proceedings was how quickly complex theological questions were resolved through simple majority votes. Issues that had divided Christian communities for centuries were settled through show of hands, decisions by bishops who had been meeting for only a few weeks. The speed of these resolutions reveals that the theological heavy lifting had been done in advance through political preparation rather than spiritual discernment during the council itself. But perhaps the most sophisticated element of the Nicaea orchestration was the creation of theological language that appeared to preserve Christian truth while actually serving imperial political needs. The phrase homoousios, of the same essence, which became central to the Nicene Creed's description of the relationship between Father and Son, was chosen not because it represented authentic Christian tradition, but because it was vague enough to accommodate different theological interpretations, while specific enough to exclude Arian alternatives. This linguistic precision allowed the council to appear to be making definitive theological statements, while actually creating doctrinal formulations that could be interpreted in multiple ways, depending on political circumstances. Bishops who had different understandings of divine nature could all agree to support creedal language that seemed to affirm their positions while providing imperial authorities with tools for suppressing whichever interpretations became politically inconvenient. The bishops who attended Nicaea genuinely believed they were participating in a holy council guided by divine inspiration to resolve theological disputes that threatened Christian unity. They didn't realize they were actually implementing a political agenda designed to transform Christianity from a diverse spiritual movement into a uniform imperial institution. The theological decisions they made through prayer and deliberation had been predetermined through months of careful political preparation that ensured predetermined outcomes while maintaining the appearance of spiritual authenticity. By the time the council concluded, Constantine had achieved his primary objective, the creation of a single, officially approved version of Christianity that could serve as a unifying force throughout his empire. But this achievement required the systematic suppression of theological alternatives that had been preserved for centuries and the manipulation of religious leaders who thought they were serving God while actually serving imperial political interests. The Christianity that emerged from Nicaea bore the marks of its political origins in ways that would influence the development of Western civilization for centuries to come. The theological diversity that had characterized the first 3 centuries of Christianity had been reduced to a single orthodox position that reflected imperial needs rather than authentic Christian tradition. The bishops who participated in this transformation were convinced they had been guided by divine inspiration, when they had actually been manipulated through sophisticated political engineering. The orchestrated assembly at Nicaea represents one of the most successful propaganda campaigns in human history, a political manipulation so effective that its participants never realized they were being controlled, and its results were accepted as divine truth by billions of people across nearly 2 millennia. The ink was barely dry on the Nicene Creed when the most systematic destruction of knowledge in ancient history began. What followed the council wasn't simply theological disagreement or religious persecution. It was a coordinated campaign to eliminate entire categories of human thought and erase centuries of spiritual development from historical memory. The implementation of the Nicene decisions required more than doctrinal statements and episcopal decrees. It required the physical destruction of texts, the silencing of teachers, and the dismantling of communities that had preserved alternative Christian traditions for generations. Constantine's advisors understood that successful suppression would need to be so thorough that future generations would have no way of knowing what alternatives had existed. The manuscript burning began within months of the council's conclusion. Imperial agents, working with newly orthodox bishops, systematically identified libraries, scriptoriums, and private collections that contained texts deemed heretical by Nicene standards. The Gospel of Thomas, which had circulated widely throughout the Eastern Empire, was specifically targeted for destruction. Copies were confiscated from churches, monasteries, and individual believers who had treasured these texts as authentic records of Jesus' teachings. But the burning wasn't random destruction, it was carefully catalogued elimination. Lists were compiled of specific texts to be destroyed, alternative gospels to be banned, and theological concepts to be erased from Christian consciousness. The Gospel of Mary Magdalene, the Gospel of Philip, the Dialogue of the Saviour, and dozens of other texts that had been read and revered for centuries were systematically hunted down and eliminated. Contemporary accounts reveal the psychological impact of this destruction on Christian communities that had built their spiritual lives around texts that were suddenly declared not just wrong, but forbidden. Bishop Epiphanes of Salamis wrote about communities where believers wept as their sacred books were taken from them and cast into flames, watching centuries of spiritual wisdom reduced to ash and smoke. The suppression of women's leadership in Christian communities required particularly sophisticated methods because it involved not just destroying texts, but rewriting the living memory of Christian organizational structures. Archaeological evidence shows that women had served as bishops, priests, and deacons throughout the Christian world before Nicaea. Inscriptions from the 3rd and 4th centuries identify women with titles like Theodora Episcopa, Bishop Theodora, and Lita, Presbytera priest, Lita, after Nicaea. These inscriptions were systematically altered or destroyed. Stone monuments were recarved to change feminine titles to masculine ones. Church records were edited to replace references to female clergy with male names. Most effectively, new canonical laws were created that made women's ordination appear to have always been forbidden, rather than a practice that was being eliminated for political reasons. The theological arguments used to justify women's exclusion from leadership were themselves fabrications created after Nicaea. The letters attributed to Paul that restrict women's roles in churches were either forgeries created during this period or genuine letters that were heavily edited to support post-Nicaea gender hierarchies. The portrayal of Mary Magdalene as a reformed prostitute rather than an apostolic leader, was systematically promoted through new, legendary accounts that replaced older traditions of her leadership role. Perhaps most systematically eliminated were the Christian communities that taught reincarnation and the pre-existence of souls. Origen's teachings about the soul's journey through multiple lifetimes had been widely accepted throughout the Eastern Church, supported by sophisticated theological arguments and careful biblical interpretation. His schools in Alexandria and Caesarea had trained generations of Christian leaders who understood reincarnation as compatible with, even necessary for, understanding divine justice. The elimination of reincarnation from Christian doctrine required not just condemning Origen's teachings, but creating new theological frameworks that could explain suffering, inequality, and divine justice without reference to previous lifetimes. The doctrine of original sin, which would become central to post-Nicaea Christianity, was developed specifically to replace reincarnation-based explanations of human suffering with concepts that supported institutional authority rather than individual spiritual development. The suppression campaign also targeted Christian communities that maintained the mystical and esoteric traditions that had characterized much early Christian practice. Gnostic communities throughout Egypt and Syria had developed sophisticated techniques for spiritual transformation, meditation practices, and direct religious experience that didn't require institutional mediation. These practices were not just discouraged, they were redefined as demonic influences that endangered the souls of practitioners. Speed and thoroughness of this suppression reveals the level of planning that had preceded the Council of Nicaea. The infrastructure for identifying and eliminating alternative Christian traditions had been developed in advance, waiting only for the theological justification that Nicaea provided. Local bishops had been prepared with lists of texts to confiscate, teachers to silence, and practices to forbid. The systematic nature of the campaign suggests coordination at the highest levels of imperial and ecclesiastical authority, but the most sophisticated aspect of the suppression was the creation of new historical narratives that made the eliminated alternatives appear to have never been legitimate parts of Christian tradition. New church histories were written that portrayed alternative gospels as late forgeries rather than ancient texts. Theological diversity was reframed as confusion that had been clarified by Nicene orthodoxy rather than authentic variety that had been politically suppressed. The councils that followed Nicaea continued and intensified this revisionist process. The Council of Constantinople in 381 AD specifically condemned Origen's teachings about reincarnation and the pre-existence of souls. The Council of Ephesus in 431 AD formally defined Mary Magdalene's role in ways that eliminated references to her apostolic authority. Each subsequent council added new layers of orthodox interpretation that made the pre-Nicea diversity of Christianity increasingly invisible to historical memory. The psychological techniques used to ensure compliance with the suppression were remarkably sophisticated. Christian communities weren't simply told that their traditional texts and practices were wrong. They were convinced that preserving these traditions would endanger their eternal salvation. Fear replaced theological argument as the primary tool for ensuring conformity to post-Nicea orthodoxy. Local bishops were given incentives to identify and eliminate alternative Christian practices in their dioceses. Those who demonstrated zealous opposition to heretical teachings received imperial favor, additional resources, and promotion within church hierarchies. Those who showed tolerance for theological diversity found themselves under investigation for their own orthodoxy, creating powerful incentives for participation in the suppression campaign. The elimination of theological diversity also required controlling the education of future Christian leaders. The schools and libraries that had preserved alternative Christian traditions were either closed or fundamentally restructured to teach only Nicene orthodoxy. New generations of Christian clergy were trained exclusively in post-Nicaea theology, ensuring that they would have no knowledge of the alternatives that had been eliminated. Perhaps most effectively, the suppression campaign created new forms of Christian identity that were defined primarily through opposition to eliminated alternatives. Orthodox Christians learned to define themselves not just through positive beliefs, but through rejection of Arian, Gnostic, and other alternative positions. This oppositional identity made any curiosity about suppressed traditions feel like betrayal of authentic Christian faith. The success of the post-Nicaea suppression was so complete that for over 15 centuries, most Christians had no idea that the theological diversity that had characterized the first 3 centuries of Christianity had ever existed. The alternatives that were eliminated at Nicaea wouldn't begin to resurface until modern archaeological discoveries in the 19th and 20th centuries revealed texts and traditions that had been hidden since the 4th century, but the suppression wasn't entirely successful. Some communities managed to preserve fragments of alternative Christian traditions by disguising them within orthodox frameworks. Some texts survived in hidden libraries or were copied in secret by individuals who recognized their value despite official condemnation. Some practices continued in marginalized communities that maintained ancient traditions while outwardly conforming to orthodox requirements. The great erasure that followed the Council of Nicaea represents one of the most successful campaigns of intellectual suppression in human history. It transformed Christianity from a diverse spiritual movement into a uniform institutional religion, eliminated centuries of theological development, and created new forms of religious authority that served political rather than spiritual purposes. The Christianity that survived this suppression bore little resemblance to the Christianity that had existed before Constantine's intervention. But the elimination had been so thorough that most believers never realized what had been lost. What the architects of the post-Nicaea suppression couldn't have anticipated was the determination of small groups of believers who refused to let centuries of spiritual wisdom disappear into imperial flames. While the official Christian world witnessed the systematic destruction of alternative texts and traditions, a hidden network of preservation began operating in the shadows, copying forbidden manuscripts, maintaining banned practices, and waiting for a time when suppressed truths could safely resurface. The most sophisticated preservation efforts centered around the Egyptian desert monasteries, where monks who understood the value of the texts they were ordered to destroy instead created elaborate hiding systems. The monastery of St. Catherine in the Sinai Peninsula became a particular center for this clandestine preservation work. Monks would publicly burn worthless materials, while secretly burying authentic texts in sealed jars hidden. Throughout the desert, archaeological evidence reveals that this underground preservation was far more extensive than previously understood. The discovery of the Nag Hammadi Library in 1945 represents just one example of what was likely a systematic effort to hide important texts. Throughout Egypt and the Middle East, carbon dating and linguistic analysis suggest that many of these hidden collections were specifically assembled during the decades following Nicaea, when the suppression campaign was at its most intense, but the preservation effort extended beyond simply hiding manuscripts. Entire communities developed sophisticated methods for maintaining forbidden theological concepts within apparently orthodox frameworks. Gnostic ideas about direct spiritual experience were preserved through mystical practices that appeared to conform to post-Nicaea Christianity. Beliefs about reincarnation were maintained through code. Language about spiritual cycles and soul purification, women's spiritual authority was preserved through veneration of female saints who functioned as surrogate apostolic figures. The Syrian Christian communities developed particularly ingenious methods for preserving banned traditions. They created liturgical texts that appeared to support Nicene orthodoxy but contained hidden layers of meaning that preserved Gnostic and Arian theological concepts. These texts could be read aloud in Orthodox worship services without raising suspicion, while initiates who understood the coding could access the deeper spiritual meanings that had been banned from public expression in Asia Minor. Communities that had maintained the Gospel of Thomas traditions developed oral preservation techniques that allowed the text to survive even when physical copies were destroyed. Master teachers would memorize entire sections of banned Gospels and pass them down through generations of students who appeared to be studying conventional Christian doctrine. These oral traditions maintained not just the content of suppressed texts, but also the interpretive frameworks necessary for understanding their spiritual significance. Perhaps most remarkably, some Christian communities managed to preserve banned traditions by embedding them within the emerging cult of saints and martyrs. Mary Magdalene's apostolic authority was preserved through veneration practices that portrayed her as the apostle to the apostles, despite official teachings that denied women's capacity for apostolic leadership. Traditions about Jesus' survival of the crucifixion were maintained through stories about saints who had experienced mystical resurrections or divine transformations. The Vatican itself became an unwitting participant in this preservation effort, while papal authorities worked to eliminate heretical texts from public circulation. They maintained copies in restricted archives for the purpose of understanding what must be refuted. These Vatican collections inadvertently preserved many texts that would otherwise have been completely lost, creating a hidden library of suppressed Christian traditions within the heart of the institution that had banned them. But the preservation effort wasn't limited to hiding physical texts. It also involved maintaining the intellectual frameworks necessary for understanding alternative Christian theology. Secret schools continued to operate throughout the post-Nicaea period, training students in philosophical and theological approaches that could recognize the authentic spiritual content hidden within banned materials. These schools preserved not just forbidden knowledge, but the methods for interpreting and applying that knowledge to contemporary spiritual needs. The most sophisticated preservation networks developed international connections that allowed dangerous knowledge to flow between different regions despite imperial efforts to suppress it. Syrian monks would copy texts preserved by Egyptian hermits. African bishops would secretly share theological insights with Spanish mystics. These networks operated through coded correspondence, trusted messengers, and carefully planned meetings that appeared to be conventional religious gatherings. Women played crucial roles in these preservation networks, often serving as the actual guardians of hidden texts and traditions, while male religious leaders provided public cover for their activities. Many of the manuscripts discovered in modern archaeological finds show evidence of having been copied by female scribes, suggesting that women continued to function as theological scholars and preservationists even after their official exclusion from Christian leadership roles. The psychological pressure on Preservation Network participants was intense. They lived with constant awareness that discovery would mean not just personal persecution, but the destruction of irreplaceable spiritual resources that they held in trust for future generations. Letters and chronicles from this period reveal the emotional toll of maintaining forbidden knowledge while publicly conforming to orthodox requirements that they knew to be historically and theologically inaccurate. Some preservation communities developed sophisticated theological rationales for their clandestine activities. They argued that maintaining suppressed Christian traditions was actually a form of faithfulness to Jesus' authentic teachings, even if it required disobedience to post-Nicaea church authorities. These communities saw themselves as preserving the true Christian heritage against political manipulation rather than engaging in heretical rebellion against legitimate religious authority. The emergence of Islamic civilization in the 7th century created new opportunities for Christian preservation networks. Islamic scholars who maintained their own alternative perspectives on Jesus and Christian history sometimes provided safe haven for Christian texts and traditions that were being suppressed in Byzantine territories. Some banned Christian materials survived in Arabic translation, when the original Greek and Latin versions had been destroyed. Medieval Christian mystics often drew from preservation network resources without explicitly acknowledging their sources. The writings of figures like Meister Eckhart, Hildegard of Bingen, and John Scotus Erigenia contain ideas and practices that clearly derive from pre-Nicea traditions, suggesting that underground preservation efforts successfully transmitted forbidden knowledge across centuries of official suppression. The Renaissance recovery of ancient texts often involved rediscovering materials that had been preserved by these underground networks rather than finding completely unknown documents. Many of the new theological and philosophical ideas that emerged during this period were actually ancient Christian concepts that had been maintained in hidden form since the post-Nicea suppression. The Protestant Reformation drew extensively from preservation network resources, though reformers often didn't realize the sources of their theological insights. Luther's emphasis on individual spiritual authority, Calvin's interest in predestination, and various Protestant approaches to biblical interpretation all echoed themes that had been preserved by communities maintaining pre-Nicea traditions. Perhaps most importantly, the preservation networks maintained not just ancient texts and ideas, but the intellectual courage necessary to question official religious narratives. Communities that had spent centuries secretly maintaining forbidden knowledge developed sophisticated abilities to distinguish between politically motivated doctrine and authentic spiritual insight. These analytical skills proved essential when modern archaeological discoveries began revealing the extent of post-Nicea suppression. The hidden preservation effort that began in the 4th century represents one of the most successful underground intellectual movements in human history. Despite centuries of persecution, systematic destruction, and official erasure, significant portions of the pre-Nicea Christian heritage survived in forms that allowed modern scholars to reconstruct what had been eliminated from conventional Christian tradition today. As archaeological discoveries continue to reveal new examples of hidden texts and preserved traditions. We're gaining appreciation for the courage and sophistication of the preservation networks that operated in the shadows of official Christianity. These communities understood that spiritual truth was too valuable to be sacrificed to political expediency, and they were willing to risk everything to ensure that future generations would have access to the authentic diversity of early Christian tradition. The underground preservation effort proves that suppression, no matter how systematic and violent, cannot completely eliminate ideas and practices that address genuine human spiritual needs. Truth has a persistence that outlasts the institutions that try to control it, and communities committed to preserving that truth can maintain it across centuries of official hostility. December 1945. 2 Egyptian farmers digging for fertilizer near the town of Nag Hammadi struck their spades against something hard buried in the desert sand. What they uncovered would shatter 16 centuries of carefully maintained religious narratives and vindicate everything that underground preservation networks had risked their lives to protect. Inside a large earthenware jar, wrapped in leather bindings, lay 13 papyrus codices containing 52 texts that the Council of Nicaea had ordered destroyed forever. The Nag Hammadi library contained the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Philip, the Gospel of Truth, the Dialogue of the Saviour, and dozens of other texts that proved beyond doubt that the theological diversity suppressed after Nicaea had been authentic, sophisticated, and widespread throughout the early Christian world. These weren't late forgeries created by heretical sects. They were genuine 1st and 2nd century documents that preserved teachings and traditions that had been systematically eliminated from Orthodox Christianity. But the modern revelation of suppressed Christian truth began even earlier, in 1886, when a papyrus dealer in Cairo offered European scholars a text that would become known as the Berlin Gnostic Codex. This manuscript contained the Gospel of Mary, which presented Mary Magdalene as Jesus' most trusted disciple and revealed the systematic exclusion of women from apostolic authority that had been implemented after Nicaea for the first time in over 15 centuries. Scholars could read Mary's own account of her relationship with Jesus and her conflict with the male disciples who wanted to deny her authority. The discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls between 1947 and 1956 provided additional confirmation that underground preservation techniques had been used throughout ancient Palestine to hide important texts from destruction. The Qumran community had buried their entire library in caves when they realized that their alternative interpretations of Jewish and early Christian tradition would not survive the political changes sweeping through 1st century Palestine. These archaeological discoveries revealed that the post-Nicaea suppression had been even more systematic and successful than previously understood. The texts that survived in hidden libraries represented only a fraction of the theological diversity that had once flourished throughout the Christian world. For every gospel that had been preserved in Egyptian desert monasteries, dozens of others had been permanently lost to imperial destruction campaigns. But the modern revelation wasn't limited to ancient manuscripts. It also involved the development of new scholarly methods that could analyze the formation of Orthodox Christianity with unprecedented precision. Form criticism, source criticism, and redaction criticism allowed scholars to identify the layers of editorial manipulation that had transformed early Christian texts into politically acceptable documents that supported post-Nicea orthodoxy. The Jesus Seminar, founded in 1985, applied these analytical methods to determine which sayings attributed to Jesus in the canonical Gospels were likely authentic, and which had been added by later editors to support specific theological or political agendas. Their conclusions vindicated many of the alternative Gospels that had been banned at Nicaea, particularly the Gospel of Thomas, which contained sayings that were demonstrably older and more authentic than parallel materials in the canonical New Testament. Modern biblical scholarship has revealed that the canonical Gospels underwent extensive editing during the period between Nicaea and the final establishment of the biblical canon in the late 4th century. Passages that supported women's leadership, taught reincarnation, or suggested that Jesus had survived the crucifixion were systematically removed or altered to conform to post-Nicene orthodoxy. The Gospels that most Christians read today are heavily redacted versions of earlier texts that contained far more theological diversity. The discovery that the letters attributed to Paul had been extensively forged and edited proved particularly devastating to Orthodox claims about apostolic authority. Scholarly analysis revealed that many of the passages used to justify women's exclusion from church leadership, condemnation of alternative Christian practices, and establishment of hierarchical authority structures were either complete fabrications or massive distortions of authentic Pauline materials. The computer analysis of ancient manuscripts has accelerated the modern revelation by allowing scholars to identify textual variants and editorial changes with unprecedented accuracy. Digital imaging techniques can reveal erased text, detect overwritten passages, and identify different scribal hands within individual documents. These technologies have shown that the suppression campaign continued for centuries after Nicaea, with manuscripts being continuously edited to remove traces of banned theological concepts. Perhaps most remarkably, modern archaeological techniques have begun to validate the historical accuracy of suppressed Gospels in ways that challenge the authenticity of canonical accounts. Archaeological evidence from 1st century Palestine supports many claims made in the Gospel of Thomas and other banned texts, while contradicting details found in the canonical Gospels that appear to have been added by later editors who lacked accurate historical knowledge. The Catholic Church's response to these modern revelations has evolved from outright denial to careful damage control that acknowledges the discoveries while minimizing their theological significance. The Second Vatican Council in the 1960s officially recognized that the biblical canon had been formed through human historical processes rather than direct divine revelation, but insisted that the Holy Spirit had guided the selection process to ensure that authentic Christian truth had been preserved. Contemporary Catholic scholarship has developed sophisticated methods for acknowledging the existence of alternative early Christian traditions while maintaining that Orthodox Christianity represents the most authentic interpretation of Jesus' message. This approach allows the Church to appear open to historical evidence, while avoiding the implications of that evidence for traditional claims about apostolic authority and doctrinal development. But the digital age has made it impossible for religious institutions to control access to suppressed materials or limit scholarly investigation of forbidden topics. Complete translations of banned Gospels are freely available online, often with better manuscript evidence than many canonical texts. Academic research into early Christian diversity has expanded beyond traditional religious institutions to secular universities that have no institutional interest in preserving orthodox narratives. The Internet has also enabled the development of new forms of Christian practice that draw directly from pre-Nicea traditions rather than post-Nicea orthodoxy. Communities of Gnostic Christians study the Gospel of Thomas and other banned texts as their primary scriptures. Johannine Christians focus on the mystical elements of early Christianity that were suppressed after Nicaea. Magdalene Christians restore women to full apostolic authority based on evidence from suppressed Gospels. These contemporary alternative Christian movements represent the first time since the 4th century that suppressed traditions have been able to function openly rather than underground. They provide living demonstrations that the theological alternatives banned at Nicaea offer compelling spiritual resources that address contemporary needs for direct religious experience, gender equality, and individual spiritual authority. The modern revelation has also exposed the extent to which Western civilization was shaped by the suppression of early Christian diversity. The hierarchical authority structures, gender inequalities, and institutional control over spiritual truth that characterized medieval and early modern Europe all trace back to theological concepts that were artificially imposed at Nicaea, rather than representing authentic Christian tradition. Scholars are beginning to recognize that the Renaissance, the Reformation, the Enlightenment, and the scientific revolution all involved partial recoveries of intellectual approaches that had been suppressed after Nicaea. The emphasis on individual reasoning, direct access to truth, and skepticism toward institutional authority that characterized these historical movements actually represented returns to early Christian values that had been eliminated. From Orthodox tradition, the ongoing archaeological discoveries continue to vindicate the underground preservation networks that maintained forbidden knowledge across centuries of persecution. Nearly every major manuscript find from the past century has revealed additional evidence of pre-Nicea theological diversity and post-Nicea suppression. The pattern suggests that much more suppressed material remains to be discovered in hidden libraries throughout the Middle East, North Africa, and Europe, but perhaps the most significant aspect of the modern revelation is how it demonstrates the ultimate futility of suppressing spiritual truth. Despite the most systematic destruction campaign in ancient history, despite centuries of persecution and official erasure, despite the transformation of Christianity into an imperial institution designed to serve political rather than spiritual purposes, the authentic diversity of early Christian tradition survived long enough to be rediscovered by modern scholars. The modern revelation proves that the underground preservation networks were right to risk everything to maintain forbidden knowledge. The texts they hid and the traditions they preserved provide contemporary seekers with access to forms of Christianity that are both more historically authentic and more spiritually relevant than the Orthodox tradition that was imposed at Nicaea for political reasons. Today, for the first time since the 4th century, people can study the full range of early bursting diversity and make informed decisions about which traditions speak to their spiritual needs. The suppression that began at Nicaea has finally been broken, and the truth that was banned 16 centuries ago is once again available to guide human spiritual development. In the digital age, as ancient manuscripts become freely accessible through online databases and scholarly research challenges, traditional religious narratives, the same institutional forces that orchestrated the Council of Nicaea continue their efforts to control how humanity understands Christianity's origins. The methods have evolved, but the fundamental objective remains unchanged. Preserve institutional authority by limiting access to information that challenges foundational claims about divine sanction and apostolic succession. The Catholic Church's response to modern archaeological discoveries reveals sophisticated damage control strategies that acknowledge the existence of suppressed traditions while minimizing their theological significance. when the Nag Hammadi library forced recognition that alternative gospels had been systematically eliminated from early Christianity, Vatican scholars developed new categories of interpretation that could accept the historical evidence while maintaining orthodox theological conclusions. The Church now officially acknowledges that early Christianity was diverse and that the biblical canon was formed through human historical processes, but frames this diversity as confusion that was clarified through divine guidance rather than authentic theological alternatives that were suppressed for political reasons. This rhetorical strategy allows modern Catholics to feel that their institution is transparent about historical evidence while avoiding the implications of that evidence for traditional claims about exclusive religious authority. Contemporary Vatican document. Classification policies reveal ongoing nervousness about materials that could further undermine orthodox narratives. Access to medieval manuscripts dealing with alternative Christian traditions remains restricted, often requiring special papal permission that is rarely granted to scholars whose research might challenge institutional positions. The same patterns of suppression that began at Nicaea continue through bureaucratic rather than violent means. But the digital revolution has made traditional information control increasingly ineffective. Complete translations of banned gospels are available through academic databases, online archives, and even mobile applications that allow anyone to study suppressed Christian traditions without institutional permission. The texts that underground preservation networks risked their lives to maintain are now accessible to millions of people who can compare alternative Christian teachings with orthodox doctrine and reach their own conclusions about theological authenticity. This democratization of access to suppressed knowledge has enabled the emergence of contemporary Christian movements that draw directly from pre-Nicea traditions, rather than post-Nicea orthodoxy. Gnostic Christian communities study the Gospel of Thomas as their primary scripture, finding in its emphasis on direct spiritual experience a more compelling spiritual path than Orthodox Christianity's institutional mediation. Progressive Christian theologians argue that the suppressed traditions reveal a more inclusive and egalitarian vision of Christian faith that better addresses contemporary spiritual needs. The feminist theological movement has been particularly energized by evidence of women's leadership in pre-Nicea Christianity. The discovery that Mary Magdalene functioned as an apostolic leader, that women served as bishops and priests throughout the early Christian world, and that their authority was systematically eliminated after Nicaea has provided historical validation for contemporary arguments about gender equality in religious leadership. Perhaps most significantly, the modern revelation of suppressed Christian diversity has contributed to broader cultural skepticism about institutional claims to exclusive truth. If the most powerful religious institution in Western history was willing to systematically destroy alternative theological traditions and maintain false narratives about Christian origins for 16 centuries, what does that suggest about other institutional claims that cannot be independently verified? The implications extend far beyond religious studies into questions about how knowledge is controlled, how historical narratives are constructed, and how institutional power shapes public understanding of truth itself. The same analytical methods that revealed the political manipulation of Christian doctrine at Nicaea can be applied to other historical narratives that serve institutional interests rather than reflecting empirical evidence. Educational institutions face particular Challenges in addressing the modern revelation of Nicaea's suppression campaign. Teaching accurate history about early Christian diversity conflicts with the religious sensibilities of many students and parents who prefer traditional narratives about Christian origins. Many textbooks continue to present post-Nicea orthodoxy as representing authentic Christian tradition while treating suppressed alternatives as marginal curiosities rather than legitimate theological positions that were eliminates through political manipulation the psychological impact of discovering that fundamental religious beliefs may be based on politically motivated historical fabrications can be devastating for individuals whose spiritual identities are built around orthodox Christian narratives. Some people respond to evidence of Nicene suppression by rejecting Christianity entirely, while others attempt to reconstruct more authentic forms of Christian practice based on pre-Nicea traditions. But the modern revelation also offers opportunities for spiritual renewal that transcends the limitations of institutional Christianity. Access to suppressed gospels and alternative theological traditions provides contemporary seekers with resources for direct spiritual experience that don't require institutional mediation. The teachings that were banned at Nicaea often emphasize individual spiritual development, mystical experience, and direct access to divine truth that resonates with contemporary interests in personal spirituality and religious autonomy. The emergence of the Internet has created new forms of religious community that can maintain alternative Christian traditions without geographical concentration or institutional support. Online communities study banned gospels, practice suppressed forms of Christian meditation, and develop theological interpretations that draw from the full range of early Christian diversity rather than being limited to post-Nicea orthodoxy. These digital religious communities face their own challenges, including the difficulty of distinguishing between historically grounded alternative traditions and contemporary fabrications that claim ancient authority. The same technologies that make suppressed knowledge accessible also enabled the creation of materials that appear to have ancient origins but actually reflect modern spiritual preferences rather than authentic early Christian practice. The academic study of early Christianity has been transformed by access to previously suppressed materials, but it has also been constrained by institutional pressures that limit how radical the implications of new discoveries can be acknowledged. Universities with religious affiliations face particular pressure to frame research findings in ways that don't fundamentally challenge the theological positions of their sponsoring institutions. Secular academic institutions have more freedom to pursue historically accurate research into early Christian diversity, but they often lack the resources and expertise necessary for sophisticated analysis of religious texts and traditions. The result is a fragmented scholarly landscape where the most important discoveries about Christian origins may not receive the attention and analysis they deserve. The modern revelation has also exposed the extent to which Western legal, political, and social institutions were shaped by theological concepts that were artificially imposed at Nicaea rather than representing authentic Christian tradition. The hierarchical authority structures, gender inequalities, and institutional control over individual conscience that characterize medieval and early modern European civilization all trace back to post-Nicea Christianity, rather than reflecting the diversity and egalitarianism that characterized many pre-Nicaea Christian communities. Contemporary debates about religious freedom, gender equality, and individual rights often involve implicit arguments about which version of Christian tradition should influence public policy. Those who advocate for hierarchical authority and traditional gender roles can point to post-Nicene orthodoxy as supporting their positions, while those who support egalitarian values can draw from pre-Nicea traditions that emphasized spiritual equality and individual spiritual authority. The political implications of the modern revelation extend beyond specifically religious questions to encompass broader issues about institutional accountability and the right of ordinary people to access information that affects their spiritual and political lives. If religious institutions can maintain false historical narratives for 16 centuries, what prevents other powerful institutions from engaging in similar forms of information control? Perhaps most importantly, the modern revelation demonstrates that suppressed knowledge has a persistence that outlasts the institutions that try to eliminate it. Despite the most systematic destruction campaign in ancient history, despite centuries of persecution and official erasure, the authentic diversity of early Christian tradition survived long enough to be rediscovered by contemporary scholars and practitioners. This persistence suggests that current efforts to control information and limit access to challenging ideas are also likely to fail in the long term. Truth has a resilience that adapts to new circumstances and finds new channels of expression when traditional paths are blocked. The underground preservation networks that maintain forbidden Christian knowledge across centuries of persecution provide a model for contemporary efforts to preserve and transmit information that challenges institutional authority. The Council of Nicaea represents a historical watershed where political power successfully imposed its will on spiritual truth. But the modern revelation of what was suppressed demonstrates that such victories are never permanent. Knowledge that addresses genuine human needs will eventually find ways to resurface, regardless of how systematically it has been suppressed or how powerful the institutions that oppose it may be. Today, 16 centuries after the Council of Nicaea, humanity has access to the full range of early Christian diversity for the first time since the 4th century. The question that remains is whether enough people will recognize the value of this recovered knowledge and develop the courage necessary to pursue spiritual truth despite institutional pressure to accept comfortable lies. The truth they still fear is the same truth that was banned at Nicaea. That spiritual authority comes from direct experience rather than institutional position. That divine truth is accessible to individuals without priestly mediation, and that authentic religious tradition is too diverse and too vital to be contained within the narrow boundaries that serve political rather than spiritual purposes. As we reach the conclusion of this investigation into the forbidden history of Christianity, we arrive at a moment that demands not just intellectual understanding, but personal decision. The evidence we've examined: archaeological discoveries, suppressed manuscripts, documented historical manipulation, forces every thinking person to confront a question that goes to the heart of how we understand truth, authority, and the nature of spiritual reality itself. If the Council of Nicaea really did manufacture Christian orthodoxy through political manipulation rather than spiritual discernment, if alternative gospels that were banned contained teachings closer to Jesus' authentic message than the canonical texts that survived, If women's apostolic authority was systematically erased to serve patriarchal political interests, if beliefs about reincarnation and direct spiritual experience were eliminated to strengthen institutional control, then what else has been hidden from us for nearly 2 millennia? This question extends far beyond the boundaries of religious studies or historical research. It challenges the fundamental assumptions that underlie not just Christian faith, but the entire framework of institutional authority that has shaped Western civilization for the past 16 centuries. If the most powerful religious institution in human history was willing to suppress authentic spiritual traditions and maintain false historical narratives for political purposes, what prevents other institutions from engaging in similar forms of deception? The personal implications of confronting this evidence are profound and unavoidable. For those who have built their spiritual lives around orthodox Christian beliefs, discovering that those beliefs may be based on political fabrications rather than authentic tradition can trigger a crisis, a faith that challenges not just religious convictions, but fundamental assumptions about the reliability of institutional authority and the accessibility of spiritual truth. Some people respond to this crisis by rejecting Christianity entirely, concluding that any religion capable of such systematic deception cannot serve as a legitimate source of spiritual guidance. Others attempt to reconstruct more authentic forms of Christian practice based on pre-Nicaea traditions, finding in the suppressed Gospels and alternative theological concepts resources for spiritual development that transcend the limitations of institutional orthodoxy. But perhaps the most important response involves recognizing that the suppression of early Christian diversity represents just one example of a broader historical pattern where powerful institutions sacrifice truth to maintain control. The same analytical methods that reveal the political manipulation at Nicaea can be applied to other historical narratives that serve institutional interests rather than reflecting empirical evidence. The modern world is filled with institutions that claim exclusive authority over various domains of human knowledge and experience. Educational systems control access to information about history, science, and culture. Medical establishments determine which healing approaches are considered legitimate. Political organizations shape public understanding of social and economic issues. Media corporations influence how people interpret current events and cultural developments. The Council of Nicaea provides a historical model for understanding how such institutional control operates. When powerful organizations face information that threatens their authority, they don't simply suppress that information, they create alternative narratives that serve their interests while maintaining the appearance of legitimacy. They use their control over educational institutions, communication networks, and cultural resources to ensure that their preferred versions of truth become so dominant that alternative perspectives appear illegitimate or dangerous. The techniques that Constantine and his advisors used to transform Christianity from a diverse spiritual movement into a uniform, imperial, institution-controlled selection of authorities. Predetermined outcomes disguised as open deliberation, systematic suppression of alternatives, creation of new historical narratives that make recent innovations appear ancient continue to operate in contemporary institutional settings. Understanding these techniques provides analytical tools for evaluating contemporary claims about truth and authority. When institutions resist independent investigation of their foundational narratives, when they limit access to information that might challenge their positions, when they characterize alternative perspectives as dangerous or illegitimate rather than engaging with the evidence those perspectives present. These are warning signs that political, rather than truth-seeking, motivations may be operating. The digital age has created unprecedented opportunities for individuals to access information and form communities without institutional mediation. But it has also generated new forms of information control that are more sophisticated than anything available to 4th-century emperors. Contemporary institutions can shape public understanding through selective presentation of information, algorithmic manipulation of search results, and the creation of so much competing information that ordinary people cannot distinguish between authentic evidence and manufactured narratives. But the same technologies that enable new forms of control also provide tools for resistance and alternative knowledge preservation. The underground networks that maintained forbidden Christian traditions across centuries of persecution provide a model for contemporary efforts to preserve and transmit information that challenges institutional authority, just as monks in Egyptian monasteries secretly copied banned gospels while publicly burning worthless materials. Modern truth seekers can use digital technologies to preserve and share suppressed knowledge while maintaining the appearance of conformity to institutional expectations. The question of how to distinguish between authentic, suppressed knowledge and modern fabrications that claim ancient authority requires developing the same analytical skills that the Templars used to evaluate the manuscripts they discovered beneath the Temple Mount, and that contemporary scholars use to assess the authenticity of archaeological discoveries. Truth claims must be evaluated based on evidence rather than institutional authority, but that evidence must be subjected to rigorous analysis, rather than accepted simply because it challenges established narratives. The pre-Nicaea Christian traditions that have been recovered through modern archaeological and scholarly work offer several principles that can guide this evaluation process. First, authentic spiritual traditions address genuine human needs for meaning, community, and transcendence, rather than simply providing justification for institutional power. Second, legitimate spiritual teachings encourage individual spiritual development and critical thinking rather than demanding unquestioning obedience to external authority. Third, authentic spiritual communities create space for diverse perspectives and ongoing discovery rather than claiming to possess complete and final truth. These principles suggest that the alternative Christian traditions suppressed at Nicaea were eliminated not because they were spiritually inadequate, but because they threatened institutional control by emphasizing direct spiritual experience, individual spiritual authority, and the accessibility of divine truth to ordinary people. Without priestly mediation, the recovery of these suppressed traditions in the modern era provides contemporary seekers with access to forms of Christianity that are both more historically authentic and more spiritually relevant than the orthodox tradition that was imposed for political reasons. The Gospel of Thomas's emphasis on discovering the divine kingdom within oneself, the Gospel of Mary's affirmation of women's spiritual authority, the Gnostic teaching that salvation comes through knowledge rather than faith. These perspectives offer resources for spiritual development that transcend the limitations of institutional Christianity, but the value of recovering suppressed Christian traditions extends beyond providing alternative religious options. It demonstrates that authentic spiritual insight has a persistence that outlasts the institutions that try to control it. Despite the most systematic suppression campaign in ancient history, despite centuries of persecution and official erasure, the genuine diversity of early Christian tradition survived long enough to be rediscovered by contemporary scholars and practitioners. This persistence suggests that current efforts to control information and limit access to challenging ideas are also likely to fail in the long term. Truth has a resilience that adapts to new circumstances and finds new channels of expression when traditional paths are blocked. The courage and determination of the underground preservation networks that maintained forbidden Christian knowledge across centuries of persecution provide inspiration for contemporary efforts to seek and share truth despite institutional opposition. The modern revelation of what was suppressed at Nicaea also provides historical perspective on the relationship between spiritual truth and political power. The 4th century transformation of Christianity from a diverse spiritual movement into a uniform imperial institution represents just one example of how political authorities attempt to co-opt and control spiritual traditions that originally emphasized individual liberation and direct access to divine truth. This pattern repeats throughout history whenever authentic spiritual movements gain enough influence to challenge existing power structures. Political authorities either suppress these movements through persecution or co-opt them through institutional incorporation that preserves the forms of spiritual practice while eliminating their liberating content. Understanding this pattern helps contemporary spiritual seekers recognize when institutional Christianity or any other religious traditional serving political rather than spiritual purposes. But the historical record also reveals that the authentic spiritual impulses that originally gave rise to transformative religious movements cannot be permanently suppressed through political manipulation. They resurface in new forms when historical circumstances allow, drawing from preserved traditions and contemporary insights to create fresh approaches to ancient spiritual questions. The contemporary recovery of pre-Nicaea Christian diversity represents one example of this resurgence process. The texts and traditions that underground preservation networks maintained across centuries of persecution are now inspiring new forms of Christian practice that emphasize direct spiritual experience, gender equality, and individual spiritual authority. The same values that made the suppressed traditions dangerous to 4th century imperial authorities. 4. Contemporary seekers trying to navigate the complex landscape of spiritual options available in the modern world. The Council of Nicaea provides crucial lessons about how to evaluate religious claims and institutions. Traditions that emphasize institutional authority over individual spiritual experience, that restrict access to their foundational texts and teachings, that discourage questioning and independent investigation. These characteristics suggest that political rather than spiritual motivations may be operating. Conversely, traditions that encourage direct spiritual experience, that make their texts and teachings freely available for study and analysis, that welcome questioning and diverse perspectives. These characteristics suggest greater authenticity and spiritual value regardless of their institutional size or cultural influence. The recovery of suppressed Christian traditions also demonstrates the importance of preserving and studying minority religious perspectives that challenge dominant institutional narratives. The alternative gospels and theological concepts that were banned at Nicaea survived precisely because small communities were willing to risk persecution to maintain traditions they recognized as spiritually valuable. Their courage and determination ensured that future generations would have access to forms of Christian practice that transcended the limitations of institutional orthodoxy. This preservation imperative extends beyond specifically Christian contexts to encompass all forms of knowledge and practice that address genuine human needs but challenge institutional authority, indigenous spiritual traditions, alternative healing practices, suppressed historical narratives, marginalized scientific theories. All of these represent potential sources of wisdom that may be essential for human flourishing but are vulnerable to suppression by institutions that benefit from maintaining control over their respective domains. The digital age provides unprecedented tools for preserving and sharing such knowledge, but it also requires individuals to take personal responsibility for distinguishing between authentic, suppressed wisdom and manufactured alternatives that serve contemporary political agendas rather than genuine truth-seeking. The analytical skills that scholars use to evaluate the authenticity of ancient manuscripts can be adapted to assess the credibility of modern information sources and the motivations of contemporary institutions. Perhaps most importantly, the modern revelation of what was suppressed at Nicaea demonstrates that truth-seeking is not just an intellectual exercise, but a moral imperative that requires courage, persistence, and willingness to challenge authority when that authority conflicts with evidence and authentic spiritual insight. The underground preservation networks that maintained forbidden Christian knowledge across centuries of persecution provide a model for the kind of commitment that authentic truth-seeking requires. As we conclude this investigation into the forbidden history of Christianity, we return to the question that began our journey. If the Council of Nicaea really decided what truth we are allowed to believe, then what else has been hidden from us for nearly 2 millennia? The evidence we've examined suggests that this question has profound implications not just for understanding Christian history, but for evaluating contemporary claims about truth, authority, and the accessibility of authentic knowledge. The courage to pursue these implications wherever they lead. The wisdom to distinguish between authentic, suppressed knowledge and manufactured alternatives, and the determination to preserve and share truth despite institutional oppositions. These are the qualities that the recovery of suppressed Christian traditions both requires and develops. In those who undertake this investigation, the question that changes everything is not just what has been hidden from us, but what we are willing to do with dangerous knowledge once we discover it. The underground preservation networks that maintained forbidden Christian traditions for 16 centuries provide a historical example of what committed individuals can accomplish when they recognize that some truths are too valuable to be sacrificed to institutional convenience. The Council of Nicaea may have succeeded in suppressing authentic Christian diversity for over 15 centuries, but the modern revelation of what was banned demonstrates that no suppression is permanent when people are willing to seek truth despite the costs that truth-seeking may entail. The question that remains is whether enough contemporary seekers will develop the courage and commitment necessary to continue this work in our own historical moment. If the Council of Nicaea really decided what truth we are allowed to believe, then the responsibility for discovering and preserving authentic truth belongs not to institutions, that benefit from controlling information, but to individuals who recognize that spiritual and intellectual freedom requires ongoing vigilance against the forces that would limit human access to genuine knowledge and authentic spiritual experience. The forbidden history of Christianity reveals both the vulnerability of truth to political manipulation and its ultimate resilience when preserved by people who understand its value. The question that changes everything is whether we will be among those who choose preservation over convenience, truth over authority, and authentic spiritual development over institutional conformity. The texts that were banned at Nicaea have survived to tell their story. The question that remains is whether we will have the courage to listen.